The way we lead impacts the way people live. This world needs truly human leadership.
And it's also getting really interested in the speaker in terms of not just what they're saying, but where they may go next with their thinking, rather than simply listening to reply or form a diagnosis. So giving attention is something that requires our energy as the listener, and it's a decision we make.
I'm Brent Stewart, your host. Thanks for listening. This podcast is an outreach of Barry-Wehmiller. You can find us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter at Barry-Wehmiller, and find our podcast articles and videos at trulyhumanleadership.com. Jane Adshead-Grant has been a very good friend of ours here at Barry-Wehmiller. She has interviewed our CEO, Bob Chapman, on a number of occasions. She's worked with us as a facilitator and was instrumental in putting together Bob's Truly Human Leadership Tour in Europe in 2020. But most of all, Jane is a tireless advocate for truly human leadership in the world. She's written several books, which you can find out more about on her website, janeadshead-grant.com. That's all one word. And her most recent one is titled The Listening Coach. Coach yourself through the elements of listening that are critical in life, business, and our communities. It's the second book Jane has written on one of her favorite and very important subjects, listening. And our conversation today will be about listening. Jane starts out talking about why she decided to write a second book on the topic. And so now, let's listen to Jane Adshead-Grant.
People were asking me to share more stories of the impact of listening across these different contexts in life, in business, and in our communities. Another had asked me to write a book through which they could use as a workbook so that they could capture the learnings as they read. And so I myself had found a real yearning to share what I had been learning over the last 5 years since I'd written my first book. I'd learnt more, I'd practiced more. And so therefore it seemed now the time to answer the questions that people were asking of me. That was the impetus.
Were there things in the second book that you felt were pretty significant from your first?
Well, firstly, through my interviews. So as you'll know, I interviewed Bob. And what I learnt, not just from the interview with Bob, but through my work with you at Barry-Wehmiller, I discovered the impact of listening at scale. How an organization, when you let you embed the art and skills of empathetic listening and being a key tenet of your culture of truly human leadership, the impact that had on people's lives, but not just at work. It was in their home life as well. I also learnt through my interviews with Stephanie Unwin, the chief exec of Horizon Power in Australia, the impact of listening with all your stakeholders. And Stephanie shared with me a beautiful story of how she took the board members out to the bush to meet the local Aboriginal people for whose community they were serving, that they needed to establish and wanted to understand the aspirations of the Aborigines such that they could provide the power and energy supplies that would most enable them to accomplish those aspirations for living in community and having the power sources they needed. And I also learned afresh the impact of listening to strangers, people we've never met before, through my conversations with Gavin Cargill, who is a co-founder of an organization called Value the People.
You know, when we think about listening, we think about it being an individualized thing, from me to you. Tell me a little bit more about this listening on scale and how that can be done.
Well, it was my observation of what you do at Barry-Wehmiller, in terms of providing the communication skills training and enabling leaders and individuals within the organization the opportunity to learn the skills of empathetic listening and making that a key tenet of the way you lead in an organization. For me, that's listening at scale. And in my experience and interactions with individuals at Barry-Wehmiller and teams across the globe, and visiting, we had the European Truly Human Leadership Tour back in the beginning of 2020, and seeing the impact and the stories Bob would share of how individuals across the globe were impacted by leaders who listen. And Barry-Wehmiller, for me, stand out as an organization in having this idea of listening at scale, where yes, it's an individual thing, but actually there's a consistency because you offer the skills of listening as part of your leadership development. And it becomes very apparent how people feel at work. They feel valued. And as a result of that, they're able to perform well and know that both who they are and what they do matters because they've been listened to and because they know how to listen well to their team members and beyond, actually, it's customers as well. And I think the second thing that so those were the kind of first thing was learning these different contexts of listening and the impact that has significantly at work and business and in our communities. I also learned afresh these levels of listening. So I've so far come across 5 levels of listening. Well, actually, since then, I've discerned a couple more, but to be researched further. But the 5 levels of listening I share in this book, my freshest learning is that we, in any day, in any conversation, may move in between different levels of listening, from self-listening, listening to connect with ourselves more deeply, to pause and to reflect, pretend listening, where you'll know we just simply pretend to listen, when others will actually know that we're not listening truly, but we'll just fake it. And then factual listening, we're listening to the facts to clarify our understanding. And we engage then in empathetic listening, where we listen not just to the facts, but the feelings, and get interested in the perspective of another, how they see the world. And then we move from empathetic listening into generative listening, listening to get the best out of others, to help them move into resolving situations, challenges, problems for themselves, and going to the edge of their thinking to accomplish more than they ever thought possible. And so this book is about navigating these 5 levels of listening, and it's peppered with stories and case studies in how people apply the 10 skills that I share, the 7 principles that we can adopt to overcome the 5 biases of listening that might hold us back.
Where did the 5 levels of listening come from?
It was from my observations, from my learnings. The work I did with you and the Chapman and Co. was beautiful around 3 levels of listening. And further, I discerned the self-listening through another wonderful listening expert, Oscar Trimboli, based out of Australia, who shared with me this concept of encouraging people to take time out of their day, their working day, to simply listen to themselves, to pause, to reflect, and to get more in tune. And I was interested in that, so I took it a little bit further. I researched it further, and I began to notice and observe individuals. And so I decided to hone in a little bit more on this self-listening. And I observed in people I coached and my own conversations with family, friends, and in my community, where in the self-listening, people can listen either with compassion to themselves, or they listen in combat to themselves. And so I invite listeners to really consider how we listen to ourselves in a way that's more liberating rather than limits us. And generative listening is the listening that I learned and studied with Nancy Klein, who's the author of Time to Think and president of the organization Time to Think. And this is a listening that really frees the mind rather than directs it. So we as the listener show up in certain ways of behaving and being with each other to free the mind in front of us rather than direct it. So putting it all together in this framework, and my noticings, I guess, Brent, were that we can at any time, as I mentioned, kind of move in between these different levels of listening. And when we decide to listen, and in that listening, we can discern what will be of best service to the person with whom we're exchanging or interacting with, to help them step into who they're meant to be right now. What do they need from us? What level of listening, other than pretend listening, which we'll not engage in, but only we will hold ourselves as self-awareness to realize we've wandered, our mind's wandered, so let's just pull our attention back once more and engage in a listening that will be in best service of them.
And the 5 levels of listening, which level would you say is the most revelatory for a leader?
Well, for me, it's generative listening. It's the ultimate level of listening, because it provides an opportunity, a safe environment that's free of judgment, free of interruption. And it requires a discipline for the listener to take the speaker or the thinker to the edge of their thinking And in that edge of the thinking, the outcome of which is that the speaker, the thinker, if you like, taps into their own resourcefulness of creativity and courage and actually compassion. And so I think for me, the generative listening is most revelatory for a leader because of the impact they can have on another. It goes beyond empathetic listening, which in my experience sits alongside someone so they feel and know that they're valued. And in order to help them move on and to address a challenge, an issue, generative listening is the way that we can help them move to that next place.
And in the book, you have the different skills and principles of generative listening. Talk a little bit about that.
Some of it, I think, is very intuitive, and things that, we already know, but sometimes we forget or we just don't know that we know. And so when I talk about the different skills, some of them, they're not difficult, Brent. It's just that perhaps we'll use an excuse. For example, one of the kind of foundational skills is giving your attention. And I talk about giving attention rather than paying attention because it's an active skill. And giving attention, is that holding a soft eye gaze on the other so that they know you're giving attention. It's holding that open body posture. And it's also getting really interested in the speaker in terms of not just what they're saying, but where they may go next with their thinking, rather than simply listening to reply or form a diagnosis. So giving attention is something that requires our energy as the listener, and it's a decision we make. So I guess for me, that's one of the foundational skills, is to give our attention. The others are perhaps easier or again, more obvious, eliminating distractions, so turning off notifications and turning your phone off or turning it on silent. Another is resisting the urge to interrupt. And, when I observe, I really enjoy observing conversations. I might be having a coffee and I'm noticing how people have a conversation and how often people interrupt each other. And sometimes it's with good intention, don't get me wrong. But if we truly want someone to feel heard and seen for who they are, resisting the urge to interrupt will make a huge difference to them. Because when we interrupt, the brain receives that interruption quite literally like an assault, and it throws the speaker off track. They'll forget what they were saying, and it then takes them a few moments to get back on track. You'll probably hear them say, "Oh, gosh, I was in the middle of saying something then, and I've forgotten it." So either we, the listener, interrupt, or sometimes they'll interrupt themselves. So resisting the urge to interrupt is a key skill that we can really master. And using silence, I would love to say that is another. Some people find silence quite uncomfortable. And I think in our environment today, we are often rewarded for speaking up loudly, speaking, overtly in meetings and holding the airspace to let people know that we have a thought, a view, and an opinion. And yet when we do that to fill the space, rather than allowing someone to really collate their thoughts and share and express how they feel, we can miss out on their own creativity and often the solutions or answers that were waiting to be revealed. And so that holding a silence, getting comfortable with the silence, is a skill worth mastering.
All these things that you're talking about, it's so funny to look at them just like on paper, like looking through your book and looking at them. They should be the easiest things to do. They make total sense. You look at them on paper, but in everyday conversation, they are so hard to do. For some reasons, they're sometimes so hard to do. And why do you think that is? Why do you think that we have difficulty, well, in a sense, being listeners?
I think that's such a great question, Brent. I think part of it is the societal pressure. We are peppered, we are inundated with interruptions, whether it be notifications on a phone or people coming to demand our attention. And so we're often in a system that creates this fast-paced, interruptive state. And so I think that's one key area that makes it really difficult. I think another area is this idea that, we get rewarded, as I mentioned earlier, we get rewarded for, speaking, sharing ideas, and rather than for listening. And so I think that systemic issue is a really challenging piece around. Often I'll work with clients and they'll say, I'm really worried, Jane, I want to make an impact. And in fact, I'm working with a client just now, and she's 2 weeks into her new organization. And she said to me, gosh, the meeting culture is horrendous. It's people fighting for airtime and squashing each other's ideas. And, the people who seem to get noticed are those who speak the loudest, regardless of what they're saying is of any value. And I feel that I've just got to sort of elbow my way in to make an impact through what I say, rather than spending the first few weeks or even months really listening to what individuals think and feel to get a sense of how she might add value given her gifts and talents. And so I think that's also quite difficult, is being in a system that often overlooks the impact of listening. What do you think? What, in your experience, Brent, what do you think makes it challenging?
I think you were right in the beginning. We like the response from when we are heard. And it is that kind of affirmation that you get when you say something and people have a reaction to it, whether even if it's good or bad. And I really do think that's why one of the reasons why we do have such trouble listening. And I think everything you said was very true too, because we live in a distracted society where we want to move on to the next thing. Those are very true too. I think one of the biggest issues with listening is wanting to talk and wanting to have that reaction. And when you're listening to somebody who may have a problem, you may have the intention to be empathetic, but you also want to solve that problem. You want that affirmation from solving that problem. And so it makes it difficult to help a person when you're waiting to do that, But I think that's a difficulty with listening with a lot of people. I think it's wanting to have the affirmation and the response that comes from sharing.
I really appreciate that. And I think it is our human nature. I think we are wired to solve problems. And listening to you makes me wonder if we're willing to listen and to experience the impact of having others solve their own issues in the presence of our attention, in the presence of our asking, another key skill, open questions. So I often describe listening as helping them understand themselves more fully. And I think you've reminded me too, Brent, as you sharing that there's an assumption that listening is a soft skill. And therefore, one of the challenges also is that people don't have the skills. I mean, we're never taught how to listen, whether we grow up from education. We're taught to read and to write. As we go through our education system, we're then given, public speaking classes, but we're never given the skills of listening until, they'll come to an organization such as Barry-Wehmiller, or on some of my programs. We're fortunate enough, that's what we do. We spend 3 or 4 days learning to listen. For me, Brené Brown describes it beautifully as a courage building skill, because I think it does take courage. It takes courage to listen to another. It takes courage to be willing to have your own mind changed and to resist this urge to interrupt, judge, and, as you said, solve the issue or the problem for the person. And it takes courage for us to give that space, hold that space, invite that person into their inner self to liberate their mind rather than direct it. And that is one of the most rewarding and witness-bearing experiences I would love to invite any of our listeners to engage in.
Bob often says that, listening is the most important thing that leaders can do for people within their span of care. He also says, listening is the most important thing we can do for one another. And I think when you really truly listen to someone else, I don't want to say you're making a sacrifice, but you're putting that person first. You're giving them the space to talk, giving them the space to confess, give them the space to work something out. And by just sitting there and letting them do that, you're putting them first, and it's a tremendous show of respect. Again, talking again about problems people have with listening, is when you want to solve the problem or when you want to speak for the affirmation, you're putting yourself first. Because in that moment, it's not about the other person anymore. It's about you. It's about you solving the problem. And again, I think that goes back to why it is so hard to be a listener, because true empathetic listening, you are completely and totally putting that other person first. And it's really, really hard to do sometimes.
When we listen, I think that is what we do. We want to create that opportunity for others. For me, I imagine a world where we listen first. We listen to encourage and allow others to step into and up to who they are meant to be. And of course, the ultimate is when you have two people willing to listen to each other in equal turn, just like you and I are doing now. We engage in more meaningful conversations that get to the heart of the matter, that are meaningful for what really matters, because we respect each other and the views and thoughts and feelings of each other.
In your book, you talk about the 7 principles of generative listening. I think this really works in well with what we're talking about right now, because I feel like these 7 principles put you in the space to be a good listener. Can you talk about them for a second?
Well, the first is to be at ease yourself. Quite often we talked about this world of constant interruption, distraction, and sometimes that when we decide to listen, we find that we're caught up in the internal rush in our mind, the meetings we've got to go to, the list of things we've got to do. So to be a great listener is to quieten our own mind, to be free from that internal rush and urgency. Because when we are in that way, then the speaker, the person with whom we're engaged, will feel more at ease themselves. I think another principle I talk about is holding a learning mindset. One of my favorite quotes from the Dalai Lama is, when we talk, we are just repeating what we already know. But when we listen, we may learn something new. And so for me, to be a great listener is to hold that learning mindset wherever we are in life, irrespective of our experience, hierarchy, position in organization, is to hold that learning mindset. Another is to be self-aware, is to notice your own response. And being an empathetic listener, there'll be times when what the speaker says and even what they don't say, you'll notice by the non-verbal cues, their body language, that they touch or they move you. And that might lead you into rescuing them or to offer your help to solve their issue, as you were saying earlier, Brent. And so a great principle is to be aware of that and quieten that response and keep giving your attention to the individual. And leading on to another principle is to listen for the potential and possibility in that individual. Know that they are a resourceful human being. And with our encouragement and our holding that safe space for them, they will move through wherever they're at that time. Another principle, I talk about appreciating others. And this is very akin to, of course, the tenet of truly human leadership, recognition for others. I talk about appreciating another is to share specifically a quality that we see in them, because we've discovered what we've found through the generative listening is that when we appreciate others on a ratio of 5-1, that people will feel seen, heard, and valued for who they are, because we've witnessed a quality that sometimes they haven't seen themselves, but it's the impact they've had on us. So by reflecting that back can help them build the confidence and courage within. And the remaining 2 are to be objective, to listen free from judgment and consider the difference. What I think about working with individuals and what's been so revealed across the pandemic over these last 2 years, that, what unites us is our humanity, Brent. We all have the gift of a mind, a brain, and we can think as ourselves for ourselves when given the chance to do so. And it's for us to be objective and to celebrate the difference. So our humanity is what unites us, but what's different is our education, our background, our life experience, the group identities that we may be part of. And that enriches our conversations, our life experiences. And finally is to leave your ego at the door. Refrain from the need to be right, rather to respect the individual in front of you. And so this shows up where, we may not agree with somebody, but we can still acknowledge who they are. And so when we're listening to another, it's to respect them, it's to honor the dignity, the inherent worth and value that they hold as an individual. And that offering of respect will again deepen the connection that we have. And yet we don't have to agree, but we can appreciate and acknowledge the difference that we bring. So these are the 7 principles that I share. And as we begin to consider and embody these principles, they can help us overcome some of the everyday challenges that get in our way. And they're also kind of act as anchors, if you like, that help us to become more self-aware and some of those challenges and things that we talked about earlier that make it difficult to listen.
You know, one thing that you talk about in the book that I think would be interesting for you to explore a little bit more is the importance of listening to life stories. And there's even a heading early on the book that just says listening to life stories liberates growth, and you have a story that follows. Explore why listening to life stories is liberating.
I think for me, it enhances our connection. That in itself is liberating. I mean, again, it's really interesting to experience what's happened over this last 2 years through the pandemic. And I think what I feel now is this listening to others share their story is liberating for them and us as the listener. Another way of thinking about it actually is story seekers. If we could help people, or rather through our listening, is enabling people to share their story. And I could give you an example today. I've just come back from a new client meeting that was a 3-hour journey for me, 3 trains and a taxi. And I wondered how I'd make the best use of my time. And so on the train, I was able to read and to do a little work. And then I was most looking forward to my taxi ride. I wondered who I was going to meet. And this delightful gentleman, Fernando, picked me up. And it was only a 7-minute ride. I began engaging in conversation with him. You know, and in that short taxi ride, 7 minutes, he described his life story, and just beautiful. You know, he's a granddad of 7 children, and he's been having his taxi business for the last few years, but before then was a hotel manager. And it was so interesting to learn. Here I was with a learning mindset, and I was witness to a gentleman that given his life for serving others. And what I noticed was when he dropped me off was his sense of pride. He was very proud of his grandchildren, what they'd accomplished and where they were now. One was at medical university, another one was playing football and enjoying himself. And so a sense of pride I witnessed in him. And so I asked him whether he or another would pick me up later when my meeting finished. And I was so touched to find that it was he who picked me up an hour and a half later. And so we got to continue our conversation, Brent. He further shared with me, you know, the nature of the village the town that I'd been to, and the impact the shift in society had made in that town. And he thanked me at the end of our trip. He said, thank you for making my morning. And it was just such a lovely experience. I learned a lot. I sensed the pride in him and sharing more of his story. And so for me, life stories help us connect more deeply with individuals. It gives other people the opportunity to make sense of their life and their meaning and the impact they've had on their life. And as the listener, can enrich our life. Fernando had lived in this country for 51 years, but was not born here. And so my mind wandered in terms of his own integration into a foreign country and now bringing up his family and now grandchildren. And he also shared with me how he lost his wife to cancer just 18 months ago. And yet he'd formed a life now of offering a taxi service to others and also helping his family, running the children to and from school. He'd made meaning out of his life and made the best out of his life. And it was just such a privilege to listen to that. All of that in just 14 minutes, 7 minutes there and 7 minutes coming back. So I had a wonderful morning, not only with my client, but also with Fernando. This is why listening to people's life stories really matters.
Again, it's that respect, you know, taking the time to listen to somebody, putting them first, letting them share, and then just a tremendous amount of empathy that comes from that. So, Jane, as somebody who's written a book on listening and someone who is a coach, do we ever stop learning how to listen? Do we ever stop practicing listening?
I love that. No. In a short answer, I am learning each and every day. You know, there are times when my mind wanders and I think, here I am, pretend listening. You know, I write about it. Come on, Jane, pull yourself together. I'm moved by what people tell me. So I have to really work harder bringing my attention back on them. I am always learning, and I'm always really interested in noticing. And this is what I'm doing now for my own in order to be witness to my vision of a world where we listen first so that others can step into who they're meant to be, is noticing this idea of how do we listen? What does it take? What throws us off? What gets in our way? And so the short answer is no. We can always be better listeners. We can be put in situations that, are really difficult to listen. There'll be situations maybe when you're going for Sunday lunch with, grandparents or relatives, and you're sitting around the table and they're saying the same story that you've heard week after week after week. You think, oh no, I don't want to listen again to this. And so, we have to, make the decision you spoke about earlier in service of others, for that short time we're with them, if they want to say that story again, to express our respect and dignity for who they are in that moment, is to listen, to give them the greatest gift we can give them. I do think that listening is an art and is a skill that we can all get better at. And for leaders in particular, I think sometimes people describe leadership, senior leadership, and some of my clients tell me this, that it's very lonely. But you see, my experience is if you're listening, you'll never be alone. And so with the leaders I'm lucky enough to work with, when they discern the impact of listening and employ the skills of listening, they experience greater connection with team members, deeper stakeholder relationships, enhanced problem solving, decision making, and most of all, a way higher engagement. So we can all develop further, I think, in our capacity to listen more.
If there was one thing you want someone to take away from your book, what would that be?
Give your attention. Give your attention a palpable respect for the human being in front of you. So make the decision to give your attention. The next time you engage with somebody is to really experience what that feels like for yourself, giving an undivided attention, a palpable respect, however young, however old, however different from you, and feel what that feels like as you listen to them with your undivided attention.
So how will you approach your conversations going forward? Are you there to listen? Or are you there to hear yourself talk? I'd say the former is the best way to be a good partner, friend, or leader. And it's the foundational way to build a better world. If you'd like to hear more from Jane Adshead-Grant, go to her website, janeadsheadgrant.com. That's Jane, A-D-S-H-E-A-D, grant.com, all one word. And you can also find her on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. And don't forget to find us and connect on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter at Barry-Wehmiller. And you can find more podcasts, articles, and videos at trulyhumanleadership.com. I'm Brent Stewart. Thanks for listening.